When the sky cracked open and the stars bled silver fire, humanity knew it was not alone anymore. But it was not peace that came through the void, it was her. The alien queen with eyes like frozen suns and a voice that bent armies. She came not to talk but to conquer, and with one wave of her hand the cities burned, and the oceans boiled, and earth surrendered, but one man did not kneel. He did not fight either, he simply looked her in the eye, and asked a question no one ever dared ask a conqueror before. Do you feel lonely? His name was Kael, and he was not a soldier, or a leader, or anyone important. He lived in the shadow of the fallen towers and gathered scraps from broken machines, trying to fix what no one else cared to fix. He had no family left, no home, just a stubborn heart that refused to break, even when the skies turned black with her ships in the ground, trembled under the boots of her soldiers. They were tall and cold and beautiful like sculptures of living glass, and they spoke a language that sounded like wind through metal. Kael watched them take the city in a single day. The military fought and died, and then the resistance fought and burned, and the rest of the world watched in silence as one by one the country surrendered, not out of cowardice, but because to fight her was to fight inevitability. The alien queen was not just powerful, she was unstoppable. Her name was Seraxa, and it was whispered like a curse across what remained of human voices. She stood taller than any human, her skin a deep shimmer of violet, her hair flowing like molten silver, her armor grown not forged, alive not built, and her gaze like knives carved from starlight. Kael first saw her not on a screen, like most people, but in person when she descended upon the Maiza ruins of what used to be a capital city to address the remnants herself. She did not hide behind emissaries or drones. She walked through the ash with her elite guards, and humans knelt before her, not out of loyalty, but fear. Kael, didn't he just stood there covered in soot engine grease across his fingers, a broken drone arm in one hand, and when her eyes landed on him something strange happened. She paused. No one else seemed to notice, or maybe they did and dared not speak of it. Her voice was not cruel, not mocking when she said, "You do not kneel," and Kael simply said, "No, I don't. I don't kneel for anyone who hasn't earned it." There was a silence, then a flicker across her face, not anger, but something else, something like interest. And she tilted her head as if he were a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. Then she ordered him to be brought to her ship alive. Kael expected chains and torture, but what he found was a throne room of glass and light, a floating palace above the planet held together by thought and will. And it was there that Seraxa questioned him. "Why do you not hate me?" she asked. Kael shrugged and said, "Hate is a waste of time, and I think you already have enough of that in your life." Her soldiers drew weapons, but she lifted a hand and silenced them. She wanted to hear more from this strange human, whose heart did not shake before her power. He told her about Earth before the invasion, about music and laughter and rain on tin roofs, and how silence wasn't always peace, and how control didn't always mean respect. And something in her posture softened just barely for the first time in her endless reign. Someone spoke to her, not as a god or a demon, but as a person, and when he looked at her again, he didn't see a tyrant. He saw someone surrounded by silence, trying not to drown in it. And that night, instead of a cell, she gave him a room with a view of the stars. Kael sat there looking at the constellations, wondering what would happen next. And on the bridge of her ship, the alien queen stood alone, watching a world she had taken and a man she had not broken. And for the first time in a long time, she felt something stir inside her, something she didn't know the name of, something that both terrified and intrigued her, something that made her ask herself, why did his voice echo louder than all her victories? Kael did not sleep that first night, though the room was warm and clean, and the ceiling above him shimmered like a slow river of galaxies. He sat on the edge of the alien soft bed, staring at the stars, and wondering what in the galaxy he had just done. He had spoken to the alien queen, like she was a person, not a ruler, not a warlord, not a goddess with an armada, and now he was inside her ship and still breathing, which was more than most humans could say. Her guards passed his door sometimes, their feet silent, their armor humming with strange light. They glanced at him but said nothing, and Kael didn't try to talk either. He knew better than to push too hard, too fast. Still, he couldn't help remembering her face when he spoke about Earth, not the burning cities or the surrendering leaders, but the simple things. His mother's old garden, the smell of fried food in street markets, the sound of laughter from children chasing a ball in a dusty alley. He had watched Seraxa's expression closely and saw a flicker of something there, not boredom, not anger, something like confusion, maybe longing. He didn't know what it meant, but he held on to it because it felt real the next morning, if it was even morning on a ship that drifted outside time. She came to him again, not with chains or orders, but with a question she asked, "What makes you laugh?" Kael blinked and tilted his head and smiled a little. He said, "You'd have to see it for yourself. It's not something I can explain." And for some reason that made her eyes narrow in interest, she ordered him to follow her, and he did, through halls made of living metal, past creatures he couldn't name, into a chamber where the stars bent close around them, a room where thought could create illusion, where memory could be painted in air. And Kael stood in the center and thought of the park near his old home, and suddenly it was there, green grass, warm sun, children playing, laughter echoing through the leaves. It was not perfect, but it was close enough, and Seraxa stood in the middle of it, looking around like she had stepped into another world. And Kael said, "This is what laughter looks like." And she said, "Show me more." So he did. He showed her rain and music and awkward dancing at weddings, and the way humans argued loudly but made up with hugs. And she asked, "What is the purpose of this? Why do you waste time with chaos and emotion?" And Kael said, "Because it makes us feel alive." And her expression changed again. She dismissed her guards and sat with him on a bench made of memory and asked about his childhood, and he told her everything, not just the good parts, but the painful ones too. And to his surprise, she listened, not like a ruler gathering intel, but like someone who had never heard such things before, someone who had never been allowed to share her own story. And finally Kael asked, "What about you? What was your world like before all this?" And Seraxa was silent for a long time. Then she said, "I was born to conquer. Before I knew my own name, I was trained to lead, to win, to rule. No one ever asked me what I wanted, and now I don't know if I could even answer that question." Kael looked at her and said, "Maybe you don't have to be what they made you. Maybe you can choose something else now." And Seraxa looked at him with something like disbelief, something like fear, as if she had been handed a knife shaped like hope and didn't know where to put it. She stood quickly, said nothing more, and left the room. But Kael didn't follow. He just sat there watching the memory park fade around him, and he thought about what kind of queen she might be if she ever allowed herself to be human for a moment. And far down the corridor, Seraxa leaned against a wall, one hand pressed to her chest like she was trying to calm something inside her, something warm and terrifying and unfamiliar. And she whispered to herself, "He is dangerous, but not because he resists me, because he sees me." Kael had no plan, no grand mission, no secret weapon. He wasn't a spy or a hero. Just a man with a stubborn heart and eyes that refused to look away, even when they should have. And now he walked the corridors of the enemy's ship, not in chains, not under guard, but as a guest or something that almost felt like a companion. And the crew didn't understand it. Some glared, some whispered, some watched with unreadable expressions. But none dared touch him because the queen had spoken, and her word was law. Still, Kael felt the pressure growing like invisible weights pressing against his chest. He knew this could not last, not forever. He was human, and she was alien royalty. A conqueror, a goddess to her people, but still she came to him each day, sometimes with questions, sometimes just to sit and watch old Earth memories rise from his mind into the starlit illusion room. He showed her things she had never imagined, the way children painted with their fingers, the way humans mourned with silence, and singing, the way two people could sit in a room and say nothing and still feel connected, and she absorbed it all like a starving soul soaking in light. But Kael also saw the cracks growing, the way her voice hesitated when she laughed, the way her fingers lingered on the edge of memory when he spoke of love and touch and sacrifice. He wanted to ask her more, to dig deeper, but he knew she wasn't ready, not yet. And then one day, she brought him to a chamber he had never seen before. A place heavy with shadows and machines and floating relics of old battles, and she told him, "This is where I remember the wars." And Kael stepped inside and saw not trophies, but ghosts, weapons from civilizations. She had crushed banners from cultures, erased statues broken and twisted, and in the middle of it all a floating sphere of data pulsing with dark light. And Seraxa looked at it and said, "This contains the knowledge of every species we've defeated. It is a monument to victory." And Kael said, "It feels like a graveyard," and her gaze sharpened, but not with anger, more like pain, like someone poking a wound they thought had healed. He asked her, "Why do you keep it?" And she said, "Because if I forget what I've done, I'll forget who I am." And Kael said, "Maybe forgetting is not the same as changing. Maybe you're allowed to become more than your past." And she didn't speak for a long time, but then she said quietly, "Do you know what it means when a ruler shows weakness?" Kael replied, "It means she trusts someone," and that scared her more than anything, because trust was not part of her code, not part of her programming, not something she had been bred to feel. And now it whispered through her like a dangerous wind. And that night, she didn't sleep. She walked alone through her palace of stars, thinking of Kael, of his words, of the sound of his voice, saying her name like it wasn't a curse. And in her private chamber, where no one else was allowed, she stood before the mirror and whispered, "I don't know what I'm becoming." And her reflection didn't answer. It just looked back with wide, tired eyes that no longer belonged to a conqueror alone. And Kael in his room felt the air change, the ship humming like a heart learning how to beat differently. And he wondered if a single soul could really shift the course of a queen. And if so, what price would come with that shift? And somewhere in the ship, an alarm flickered, silent, low, distant, but real, because far beyond the stars something was moving, something old, something angry. And it had just noticed the queen was beginning to change. The ship trembled, not with violence, but with the subtle pulse of tension, as if it too sensed the storm building in the dark. Kael felt it first, not with his eyes or ears, but with the way the guard stood straighter, how the crew whispered more urgently, how Seraxa's steps became slower, heavier, like a queen weighed down by choices. She could no longer escape. She didn't speak of it, not at first. She still visited. Kael still watched his memories, still sat beside him in the chamber where laughter lived, but her gaze drifted more often, her hands clenched when she thought he wasn't looking, and the silence between them grew heavier. Then one evening, as the false stars above dimmed, she finally spoke, and what she said cracked the stillness across the room like thunder. She said, "They are coming." And Kael didn't need to ask who, because her voice told him everything. Something worse than war, worse than rebellion, something old and personal and full of rage. "They are my rivals." She said, "They are my kin. I was not the only one bred for conquest, but I was the only one who won, and now they come to take back what I took. They will tear Earth apart, not for power, but for revenge, to punish me for showing weakness." And Kael stood slowly and said, "Then don't be weak, be strong. In another way, stay and fight, not for control, but for the people, for us." And Seraxa laughed a sharp, bitter sound and said, "I do not know how to fight like that. I only know how to burn." Kael stepped close, so close he could see the flicker of starlight in her eyes, and said, "Then learn now with me." And her expression broke for a moment, raw and afraid, and she whispered, "If I lose this war, one lose everything." And Kael said, "No, if you fight for something real, you win, even if you fall." Seraxa turned away and ordered her fleet to prepare for battle, but not the kind she had always fought, not destruction for the sake of power. This time she ordered evacuation of human cities, reinforcement of planetary shields, and strange alien drones rained down across Earth, not as weapons, but as protectors, and people watched stunned as the machines that once enslaved now built barriers to keep them safe. The human leaders didn't understand it. The alien captains questioned it. The rival queens did not hesitate. They came in dark ships shaped like nightmares, engines screaming with old blood and fury, and Seraxa stood on the command deck, cloaked in armor of light, her voice calm, her fingers trembling, and Kael stood behind her, not with weapons, but with words reminding her of who she was becoming, not what she had been. The battle was not like anything Earth had ever seen. The sky split, the moon cracked, and time itself seemed to ripple, and through it all Seraxa fought not just with power, but with purpose, with pain and hope, and for the first time, her enemies feared her, not because of what she could destroy, but because of what she might save. Kael watched as the queen he had once hated became the one thing he believed no conqueror could be, someone willing to fall for something bigger than herself. The battle turned tides. Broke engines screamed, but Seraxa stood bleeding golden light, her voice a sword, her heart wide open, and Kael whispered to her as her knees buckled, "I'm here, I see you." And for a moment in the middle of war, she smiled, not like a queen, but like a woman who had just learned what it meant to be free. The enemy ships fell in waves, but so did Seraxa. Her strength burned bright and wild, but even stars could collapse. And when the last rival queen screamed her final order into the void, and her fleet scattered like smoke, Seraxa dropped to her knees on the command deck. Her armor cracked, her body shaking, golden blood trailing down her side, and Kael ran to her, shouting her name through the flicker of alarms and sparks. Her guards stood frozen, unsure whether to carry her away or bow to the man she reached for, with fingers trembling like leaves in wind. And Kael caught her whispering, "Don't you dare die now, not after everything." And Seraxa smiled, faint and broken, and said, "I don't think I can hold on." And Kael held her close pressed, his forehead to hers, and said, "Then don't hold on for power, hold on for me." And something in that touch, something in his voice, lit a fire in her deeper than war and older than fear, and she did not fall. Instead, she rose slowly, supported by Kael, her eyes dim but alive, and she said, "Seal the wounds, shut the gates, let Earth breathe." And her voice echoed across the ships like thunder, calm, steady, alive, and the crews obeyed, not because they were afraid, but because for the first time they believed. And Kael stayed by her side every moment, as healers poured their strange light into her skin, as machines weaved flesh from nano threads, as she slipped in and out of pain. She did not scream, she did not curse, she simply watched Kael as if his face anchored her to life. And when she finally woke fully whole, but changed, she asked the question she had never dared ask before, "What now?" And Kael took her hand and said, "Now you live and you lead differently, not as a weapon, but as a heart." She didn't speak for a long time, but her hand tightened around his, and in the following days the galaxy watched in stunned silence as the alien queen, who had scorched planets, returned them not to ashes but to soil and breath and color. She released the captive worlds, dissolved the chain fleets, called back the death drones, and Kael stood beside her as she gave Earth back its sky, not through surrender, but through trust, and for the first time in generations, Humanity stood on even ground with a power that once towered above it. Seraxa addressed the world not with cold commands, but with a voice full of weary hope, and she said, "I was wrong to take what I did. I cannot undo what's been done, but I can choose what happens next." And she turned to Kael and said, "This man reminded me that even stars can learn to shine softer." And in that moment, the cameras caught something impossible. The alien queen lowered her head, not in defeat but in apology, and the world trembled, not in fear but in awe. Kael knew it would not be easy. Peace never was. But he also knew something had shifted, not just in her, not just in the galaxy, but in the space between two souls who should have been enemies and yet became something else, something unbreakable and deep. And when he looked at her now, he didn't see the queen who conquered Earth. He saw the woman who gave it back with trembling hands and hope in her eyes. Peace was not simple, it never had been, and even with Seraxa's change, even with Kael standing beside her like a flame refusing to flicker, there were those across the stars who would not accept it, those who saw her mercy as weakness, who plotted in shadows and whispered of rebellion and betrayal. And even on Earth, some humans did not trust her, could not forget the ruins, the dead, the days when her name meant doom. But Kael never stopped standing in the light, even when it burned, even when it cost him the respect of his own people. He told them she changed not because we forced her, but because someone dared to believe she could, and that kind of belief was more dangerous than any war. And Seraxa herself walked among the cities she once scorched, cloaked in new silence, wearing no crown, flanked only by Kael and a few quiet guards, and the people watched her with wide eyes and unsure hearts, until she knelt in the dust of a ruined school and helped rebuild it with her own hands. Alien tech stitching bricks and beams back together, but it was her hands, not the machines, that mattered. It was the look on her face, the one that said, "I remember what I did, and I won't let it happen again." And when a child walked up to her offering a wilted flower, Seraxa took it with fingers that once curled around power and now closed gently around peace. And Kael watched her, and something in his chest ached because he knew he was falling for her, not out of madness or need, but because she had become something beautiful in her struggle, something rare, a soul willing to change. And in the nights when they sat beneath the stars, when they shared food in silence and soft words, Kael saw her relax bit by bit, layer by layer, the armor within her starting to melt. And one night she asked him, "Do you still fear me?" And Kael smiled and said, "I fear losing you more." And that broke something inside her, something old and cold. And she leaned close and said, "Then never leave." And Kael said, "I won't. Not even if the stars themselves try to tear me away." And they kissed, not like conqueror and captive, but like two survivors, like two souls who had walked through fire and still reached for each other. But peace has enemies, and shadows do not die easily. And far beyond the quiet worlds, a remnant of the rival queen stirred, broken but not gone, full of poison and fury, and it whispered across old machines, "Awaken, awaken." And the weapon they had sealed away for centuries stirred in its prison of ice. It was not a fleet, not a bomb. It was something older, a living darkness, made to erase civilizations. And it opened its many eyes and said, "Seraxa lives, and now she must die." And on Earth, as Kael and Seraxa looked at the stars, they didn't know yet that something was coming, something worse than war, something born of hate and silence. And the stars would weep before it ended. The stars dimmed the night. It arrived not because of distance or clouds, but because something ancient and terrible moved between them. A thing not born but built by those who had feared Seraxa's power long ago and locked it in ice, thinking they would never need it again. But now, awakened by rage and betrayal, it fell through the galaxy like a scream, a dark sphere covered in endless eyes. wrapped in wings of shadow that tore through light itself. It had no name, only a function: to consume, to erase, and its hunger was directed not at worlds, not at cities, but at Seraxa herself, because she had broken the order of things. By changing, by choosing peace, by falling in love, and that was something the darkness could not allow. Kael saw it. Beforemost, not with his eyes, but with the way the stars flickered, and his skin crawled, and he turned to Seraxa and said, "Something is wrong," and the next moment alarms howled across every sky. Earth's moon shuddered, and her guards rushed in, speaking words in a language Kael could not follow, but he didn't need to understand, because he saw her face and knew she was afraid. And she only ever feared one thing, something she couldn't fight with force. Seraxa ordered the fleets to shield the planet, but the darkness was not a fleet. It moved through shields like mist through fingers, and Kael asked, "What is it?" And she said, "It is a mistake from before I was born. A thing made to kill queens who disobey, and now it has come for me." And Kael said, "Then let me fight it with you." And she almost smiled, but said, "This is not your fight." And Kael stepped forward and said, "Then you should not have made me love you, because I will not stand and watch you die." And Seraxa touched his face and said, "Then I will not die alone." And they stood together in the high place, the heart of her ship, surrounded by light and memory, and she reached deep into her own blood, into the core of who she was, and called upon every piece of power, every ounce of fire she had left. And Kael stood beside her, not with weapons, but with words, and his voice reached her people through the ship, through the skies, through the fear, and said, "She fights, not to rule, but to protect, and if you ever believed in what she became, stand now with her." And across the stars voices rose, not in rebellion, but in unity. Old allies, new friends, even some who had once called her enemy, and the ships lit up not with war, but with defiance. And the darkness came, and it screamed, and it clawed, and it tore, but Seraxa stood in front of Kael and roared back with everything she was. And Kael shouted her name and wrapped his arms around her, as the light in her body grew brighter, brighter, until even the shadows had to close their eyes. And in the end, it was not fire or power that ended the darkness. It was choice. The choice to stand, the choice to feel, the choice to love. And when the smoke cleared and the stars returned, Seraxa was still there, kneeling, her hands burned, her eyes closed but alive. And Kael held her and whispered, "You stayed." And she whispered back, "I stayed for you." And around them, the galaxy watched and remembered. And something changed forever. The queen, who came to conquer, now knelt beside a human who taught her the one thing she had never known, that to rule was nothing compared to being seen. To be feared was nothing compared to being loved. And as the years passed, stories spread across planets about the queen who gave back a world, and the man who gave her a heart. And some called it a myth, and others called it a miracle, but Kael only called it truth, because he had seen her break, he had seen her rise, and every time she looked at him with those starlit eyes, he knew that even galaxies could be healed one heart at a time. If you believe humanity always finds a way, subscribe for more HFY Sci-Fi stories that prove it.